doing something a wee bit different this time. I'm going to run through a program that I wrote 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, in fact. I was a bit surprised to see the label I had down the bottom referred to an organisation that no longer exists and hasn't existed for some time, which was an indication to me how long ago it was since I ran this course. We initially, this was an so-called anger management program, and I decided that I didn't like the word anger management because the question is, do we really manage our anger, or do we manage our behaviour and have to think about the emotions that drive that behaviour? So the focus of this particular course is looking at whether or not you're behaving appropriately, and if there are people around you who are saying clearly that you're not, then this is the course for you, because we will be addressing all of those issues as we progress through this course. So it's an 8-week course. I haven't bothered to go in and change any of the PowerPoint presentation that I've got here, so I'm just presenting it raw as it is. I ran this program for almost 20 years, so I guess I understand it pretty well. Now, the program is not just necessarily for those men who have anger issues. It's for anybody that has an anger issue. Anger isn't exclusively a male problem. It's a problem that all of us have from time to time, and that sometimes, though, it becomes excessive, and it certainly becomes a problem for those people that are around us, and consequently for us who are acting badly. Now, this particular course will cover a range of activities. I'll run through those in just a moment. What I do suggest that if you have got or consider yourself needing to have to deal with some behaviours, this is the place that you need to be. Now, it's not interactive, clearly, because I can't see you, it isn't live. I'm not pre-recording this, but I certainly would be interested in any feedback that you may have in relation to how you're approaching this course, any questions that you might have that you'd like to direct at me around the issues that are raised as we progress through this course. Now, with this course often came a workbook which we'd ask people to work through, and they had homework for, and so there might be occasions where you might like to have a look at our workbook, and if you do, let me know. Just send me a comment down below and I can send you the appropriate material. So let's see how this works out. I have no idea. This is a bit of an experiment for me, but I hope you can gain something from the work that we're doing about trying to better understand where your anger comes from and how it impacts you and other people around you. So we'll launch straight into the title, What to Anger. It's an 8-week course. It's presented by yours truly. And I'm a social worker by profession, have been for 30 years. And this is a course that I ran many, many years ago for an organisation called COPE, which is the Centre of Personal Education, which later became Relationships Australia. So I hope you enjoy this particular course, and we will go through what this comprises of. So that we're now talking about week 1. So week 1 is an introductory course. So there's some stuff in here which is quite self-explanatory, I guess. The introduction of the presenter, making sure that the place is a comfortable place. So if you've got issues that, or something is that I might say that makes you feel uncomfortable, please let me know and we can have a discussion around it. I always made sure that my groups were as inclusive as was possible, that everybody had an understanding where everybody else is coming from in the group. That isn't the case here because you're remote. So one of the questions we do ask is, why are you interested in this course? What is it that brings you here in the first place? So you might like to think a little bit about you and what it is that brings you directly to this particular program, and how it is that you wish to, or what do you wish to get out of it? So what I suggest that you might like to do also as you're running through this course with me is to have a notepad, write down the notes of things that are relevant to you. If you would like any information from me at all, you can put in a comment below and I'll get back to you in relation to any questions that you may have. So, and I will also I can send you the PowerPoint, as I said, I can send you the workbook, I can send you any bit of information that you might require that might help you to better understand what's happening for you and how to manage your behaviour. When I work in groups, I often find that this is rather confrontational because there's many behaviours that people have that most of us would disagree with, and there are ways by which, or there are times, I guess, where people feel confronted when those behaviours are identified, particularly when the behaviours are identified and we talk about the impact those behaviours may have on somebody else. So why are you here is an important question. Can you ask that? What do you expect to gain from being here? What is it that you would expect to learn from listening to what I have to say? Look, I don't profess to be an expert in anything. I know a lot about lots of things. I'm not an expert. There are other ways, or there are other people that can present what I'm presenting to you now differently, and maybe more comprehensively, and maybe with greater insight. I don't know. So what do you expect to gain from this? What do you want to learn? If you could just take this moment out to write that down, and we'll check that out towards the end of the course if you follow me through, and we'll see what you think you had gained, or what you hadn't gained, what you would like to have got out of it that you didn't, because everything we do is about change. So if you've got some ideas that you think might be helpful and that might help you to better understand this problem, then let me know, and I'm happy to make whatever adjustments may be required. So the first significant question I ask is, how do you experience anger? What does anger look like for you? Who is impacted by your anger? And what general impact does your anger have on your life? So we need to think about your behaviour primarily, because people experience anger usually by how you behave, not necessarily. So they might see some signs in you that would indicate that you're feeling angry, but it is really generally about your behaviour. Now, that's a bit, it can be a little bit confronting, because there are some people who would notice that you're angry without you actually doing anything. So that could be a red face, it could be you appearing agitated, which is a behaviour, but nevertheless it could be about something that you're unaware of. Eyes dilating, often people talk about raising of eyebrows, hand gestures. There could be lots of things that could indicate that you are upset, or that you're on the verge of an angry outburst. So we need to have a look at you need to think about what those particular behaviours are. But when we look at what is anger, we'll talk in greater detail about this throughout the course, but how does it get expressed? Do you see it just in terms of an outburst? Do you see it just in terms of lashing out at somebody? Or it can be experienced differently? So the question I often ask people is, can anger be okay? Are there moments where it can be okay to express anger? Now, my response to that always is yes, it is. There are moments, so we need to put anger in context. Anger can be a very helpful emotion. There are many things that have changed as a result of people becoming angry. There are a whole host of social justice issues, from Indigenous First Nation issues through to climate change, through to issues around identifying people's sexual identity. So there are a range of issues that certainly could be changed. And when I'm reflecting on it, when I first presented this course some 20 odd years ago, some of those things weren't even considered. But today they are. We have a look at Black Lives Matter, and we have a look at the social justice issues that are occurring in our society today. A lot of the change and a lot of the advocacy work is created because people start to feel angry. We look at what's happening at the moment in Iran in terms of that young woman that was killed, and the way that the population, and the women population in particular, are rebelling against that. That's because they're angry, right? So there can be times when anger expressed appropriately can be okay. And anger tells us, it gives us information about how we are feeling about a particular situation, and can even inform us, if we're aware enough, as to how to respond around that in appropriate ways. The other thing we need to consider is, what impact does anger have on those around us? Now, we can use it to bring about change, social changes. We can confront people appropriately because we're feeling angry, but in a more realistic sense, I guess not realistic, but in a sense as to how it impacts those people that are closest to us, the familial contacts we have. How does it impact them? This is something that we really need to think about and we need to consider. And the best people that can tell us about this are the people that sit around us. So it's our family, our friends, our work colleagues, those people that are closest to us will tell us exactly how those behaviours impact others. And it's often those behaviours and the impact they have on others that we need to consider. And if the reality is, if we can act badly and we can act angrily and we can hit out at people and that didn't affect anybody or no one cared, then it wouldn't be a problem. It only becomes a problem, well, actually it's a problem for us physiologically and psychologically, but it wouldn't become a major problem because people wouldn't be affected by it. And if we are considerate and thoughtful enough about other people, then clearly we'd be interested enough to be able to change those behaviours in ourselves. So we're going to be thinking a lot about how this behaviour impacts others. The other question is, how does anger make you feel? So there are lots of people who say, when I'm angry, when I've finished, I feel there's a relief. I feel like I've unloaded myself, that I've got rid of all this stuff around me, that I kind of sometimes feel better about myself, that it is like a volcano and it's released. Now, that's okay, because if you're doing that and it's not affecting anybody else, then that's fine. But when you realise how perhaps those behaviours are impacting those people around you, you might feel better in yourself that you've been able to release it, and in that moment it might be okay. But when you realise that it's impacted your partner, your children, your work colleagues and others, and they're not thinking the best of you because of those behaviours, then we need to consider how this is impacting others and what we could choose to do about it. So we're going to have a discussion about buttons and triggers. I'm going to have a conversation with you about buttons and triggers and my version of what they are, and which is an interesting conversation, I can assure you, because it's not like what most of us would consider. Now, anger is, when expressed appropriately, anger is a healthy release of tension, as I was explaining just earlier. It gets rid of all that stuff and that stuff that's building up inside of us, and that intestinal fight and battle that tends to go on around anger. That stuff will be released, once we've expressed it appropriately. It's certainly an expression of feeling, so it's anger is an emotion, so it's a cluster. We'll go into this later on. It's a cluster of feelings that all sit there, and if we're able to identify what's that anger, what comprises that cluster, then we'll be able to make decisions about how to behave differently, and it will help us to express the range of those feelings more appropriately, and we'll talk about that later as well. It's an assertion of self, because it tells us where we are at this particular point in time. It tells us about things that matter to us, things that we should be caring about, right? So there's a lot of information that tells us about who we are that comes out of anger. It's a statement of one's needs, values, and the limitations that sit around us, things that restrict us from doing the things that we really would like to do. And it's sometimes about, those limitations are about social pressures, legal pressures, things that we think that we should be able to do, but we can't. And it's also about the things that we need in our lives, and also informs us about the values. And we do a session on values, so it tells us about what those values are and whether those values are being met. It's a mode of connectedness to others, because if done appropriately and talked about appropriately, we can connect with those people that are around us in a far more meaningful way than just by exploding and expressing those behaviours in a negative way. So it is a way that we can connect with others because our anger talks about our far deeper emotions. It's a motivator for change because, as I was expressing before, if we used appropriately, it can be about the things in our world that we're unhappy with and that we would like to therefore change. It's increased openness and an increased intimacy. This is once we understand what encapsulates the anger, it allows us to be able to talk openly about all of those things that sit within that. And it also helps us to develop better relationships with those people around us, providing we're not acting badly, we're not intimidating other people, we're not damaging their well-being. Then it increases, believe it or not, intimacy with those people that mean the most to you. It's a response to overstructure. So sometimes, we often talk about people that are being micromanaged. And if you're being micromanaged, that's being overstructured, that's having too many things imposing themselves upon you. And sometimes our anger is a response to that. So we can bring about change by understanding how it is that we need to change some of the structures that are around us. It's risky because it's about letting people know how we really feel in an appropriate and managed way. And it may mean that there might be people who object to the things that we're saying and to the assertive way that we're presenting our feelings that sit around our anger. And it may mean that at some level we might lose some of those, what we consider at the time, important relationships because we're talking about what actually things mean to us. And it re-energizes relationships because it again gives those relationships a greater sense of meaning. Once someone is able to listen to us and hear what we're saying without being offended and without us acting badly. And it is enhancement of other feelings. So it helps us to understand what the other feelings are. We're going to talk about this when we talk about the anger iceberg. We'll have a look at the feelings that sit under that and how those feelings may manifest themselves in our world and how we can talk about those feelings in meaningful ways, which is not about us expressing those feelings through some negative and bad behaviour. And it exposes one's vulnerability. The one thing that I think is most important when we do this work is to understand that our feelings, the things that drive us, and I'll have a conversation about this later as well, those feelings, the things that drive us all, means that we're talking about things that are intimate to us, that we often don't talk about because we're not trained to. We often have struggled to find the words to talk about some of these things, and I'll discuss that later in the program as well. So we become vulnerable because we're letting people know what's actually happening for us. Most of us, particularly us men, believe we must be stoic, that we mustn't let people in, that our feelings are our feelings, they can't be shared with anybody else because people will use them against us, is the phrase I often hear men say. Well, it's not true, but it is an experience that some of us think that we're having. But it does create a sense of vulnerability. So we must recognise and allow ourselves to believe that anger, and this is really important, anger is a natural, normal, healthy, non-evil human feeling. Anger is as natural as love, as caring, as feeling compassionate for somebody, as empathy. It is as natural as all those things. Everyone feels it, we just don't express it. You needn't fear your anger. If you're managing your anger in an appropriate way, which is what this course is about, you need not fear it. This is so important and that you must understand at some point. Now, I've often said this to people, you needn't fear your anger, and people think it is a permission to act badly. It's not, far from it. It's about understanding that there are some issues over which you're feeling angry, but it's about understanding what those issues are, finding language to describe them, and then presenting it in a way which is non-threatening. But just think about it. If you could do all of those things, how would that change your life? How would that change your relationships with the people that matter to you the most? And we can only get there if we choose not to fear it, but we choose to understand it. Remember that anger and aggression are not the same thing. Anger can be expressed assertively. We'll do a session on assertiveness as well. In other words, talking about our feelings, expressing our feelings, expressing where we are at any given time in an appropriate and meaningful way is appropriate, and it is about expressing those. So when we talk about anger, we're talking about a range of feelings that may sit within anger. Anger, as I said before, is a cluster of feelings. So when we say anger, we're talking about that cluster, all of those feelings that sit there. And we're going to find a way to have a conversation about deciding on what those feelings are and then talking about them. Get to know yourself so you recognise those events and behaviours which trigger your anger. As some say, find your own buttons so you'll know when they're pushed. And we're doing a session on buttons and triggers. But to know yourself so you recognise that events and behaviours which trigger your anger, so you can see what's happening, so you can understand what's happening to you at any given time, and that whatever is happening to you then you can be aware of and you can mitigate against any bad behaviour that may normally result from those buttons or triggers. Learn to relax. If you have developed the skill of relaxing yourself, learn to apply this response when your anger is triggered. So what we often suggest to many is that if you understand these triggers or buttons, and we'll talk about them in a moment, then you will be able to take some time out to put a gap between the moment that you're triggered to the response that you might normally have. And you can make decisions in that moment, no matter how small that moment is. You can make decisions about how it is that you wish to be, and it's going to ensure that those people around you are safe. So, learn to relax in that moment. That's very important. And if you've developed a skill about relaxing, that's a skill in itself. So at what point do I turn to do some deep breathing, some diaphragmatic breathing perhaps from down here, and what do I do in that moment that helps me to change the outcome, the potential outcome, if it's going to be an outcome that's going to be harmful to others. Develop assertive methods of expressing your anger. Be spontaneous. Don't wait and let it build up resentment. So we're going to talk about assertion anyway, but don't allow it to build up, get more and more intense, to have that swelling in the stomach and the chest, wherever your anger accumulates. Don't allow that to become the norm. Don't wait and let it build up resentment, which is just everything on top of everything else. Stated directly, avoid sarcasm and innuendo. Use honest, expressive language. Avoid name-calling, put-downs, and physical attacks. That is a must. Keep your life clear. Deal with issues when they arise, when you feel the feelings. Now, this is a set of skills that most of you probably won't have. But this is about skill building. This is about understanding this stuff so that you can develop the skills that are important to you, so that you will not do things that are potentially harmful to other people. So you don't wait for after hours, days, weeks, just stewing over all of this stuff. Go ahead, get angry, but develop a positive, assertive style of expressing it. So we're not saying that don't be angry, don't feel angry, because we do, all of us do. Every one of us gets angry at some point. We just ask you to deal with it differently, to confront it, but find different ways of expressing it. And then you'll find that you and those around you will appreciate it, and they will appreciate you for talking about these things in a more meaningful way. So now, I'm just going to talk about buttons and triggers. So, we all know, you've all heard the expression, I think, that, he or she presses my button. And where my button is pressed, it's like a trigger to me. It's like a point at which I can't help myself, I will explode. Because we believe that other person, whoever they might be, wants us to explode. They want us to express our anger so it can justify their version of who we are. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's what we think, I understand that, but it's not necessarily true. The buttons are created by personal experiences. So this is the Tony Tonkin definition. It's not psychologically asserted or approved definition in a way, but it is mine. They have a personal experience and are determined by the degree to which these issues are still causing emotional pain. So the best example I can give of that, I think, is when a guy would say to me, when she says, you're just like your father. And immediately when they say that, I respond in a way which is, no, I'm not like my father, blah, blah, blah. How dare you even say that, blah, blah, blah. Now, that may signal that there's an issue that this person actually does have around their father, and it's something which is unresolved for them. So it's a personal issue that has yet to be resolved in their lives, and that needs to be resolved. So say, for example, this person who had an issue around his dad met up with his dad and had a discussion with his father about what those issues are, and was able to work out with his father that the issues that he's had with him really aren't all that current, that they might still have been in the past. The father apologises for those issues, for the way he was treated growing up, and he comes to realise that this man whom he hated for so long and disliked his behaviours wasn't such a bad bloke now that he has changed the way he was. Now, in that realisation, that moment, that man might think, well, this isn't a bad guy. There's lots of qualities I like about him now that I didn't notice before. So that when the other person says you're just like your father, he might be able to think, well, actually, I like my dad. I like his characteristics. I like who he is. He was bad before, but he's changed, and I need to celebrate that. Now, if he was able to have that every time someone said to him, you're just like your father, he could think about it differently. And as he's thinking about it differently, this may not be the button that sets him off. In fact, he may choose to respond totally differently by saying, well, look, I like my dad. And it may not become a button anymore. So there are these personal experiences that we have that determine the degree of which issues are still causing us emotional pain, so which these issues are still cycling around inside of us and causing us some emotional pain. Now, triggers created by environmental experiences of which the person has no control. So often these are areas in which we can perhaps have experienced a trauma. Now, for example, if you're driving, to bring up an example here in Adelaide intersection that everybody knew. So I'd say, imagine if you're driving along an intersection and someone races through a red light, they smash into you, cause great damage to your car, physical damage to yourself, and this is a hell of a traumatic experience. But then you recover physically, and every time you drive past that intersection though, your heart races, your thoughts, and you visualize that very accident, and that brings about a violent and emotional response. That is a trigger. It is a place and time in which you are triggered by something that was traumatic to you in the past. So we've got buttons and triggers. And normally I would ask, I don't know whether we'd do that here, but normally I would ask people to write down what are your buttons. So what are the things that people say and do around you that you refer to as a button, and are they a button or are they a trigger? Triggers are hard to deal with because they're traumatic. Buttons are easier to manage because they're about emotions specifically, and they're about someone else's behaviour generally. So which ones do you notice are most important. Imagine this. Imagine that you were able to remove physically those, or emotionally, those buttons from you. The buttons became less and less significant. How different do you think it would be for you if that was the case, if those buttons could be taken from you? How many things would you choose not to respond to in ways which would have damaged or hurt other people around you? How different would that be if you could remove those buttons? Well, I'm letting you know, folks, that it is quite possible for that to happen, where you can have those buttons removed from you. Now, I've still got a fair bit that I can run through on this course, so I'm going to move that to my next video, which will be released in the next day or so. So if you want to find out what sits in the next video, we're talking about blaming others, being aggressive, interrogations, destructive ways of expressing anger we're going to have a look at next, and then we're going to be talking about early warning signs and taking responsibility for your anger. So we'll have that discussion next time when we get together. So if you've got any questions about anything I've said right now, put them below. If you would, and if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, just so you get some further notifications over the coming weeks, please do so. There's a lot in this course that has a great deal of value, I believe. There's a lot you can learn from it. So participate as best as you can and get to know how you're responding to things around your anger in particular. And I says 8 weeks, but probably be much longer for that, given I'm only doing 30-minute videos. And remember that each week actually is 2.5 hours. So I'll try and condense it down as best I can, but let me know what you think and stick by for week 2, which should be coming up within the next couple of days. Try and do 2 or 3 a week. So join me, and I hope that you're enjoying this conversation. If you've got any questions, please put them down below and I will respond to them. Take care, everybody. Look after yourselves and be safe.